I'm really overwhelmed by so many researchers trying to work out how we can continue to have a world worth living in. So thank you for being here. Well, I'm belonging to a very small group who, instead of seeing all the bad things happening in the world, try to dig up possibilities for change. When I sit at my desk, I get totally depressed. When I go out in the world, I see small loopholes for change and possibilities by following the actors. And it is based on staying with the actors out there that I will make my speech. But I think we are social scientists which are trying to find what I call a new growth and development regime in a very frustrating situation, because time after time there pops up a new solution. The Dutch miracle, the Irish tiger, the Finnish innovation system, Denmark's flexicurity system, and then after a while the possibility seems to die. For me it is, I'm an old, as a student I was a mathematical economist, and we always made models where there was a hell of a lot of equations, but there were even more variables. So we had to try to iterate towards a solution, and then it always turned out that some of the constancies would jeopardize the iteration that we had approximated. I think that our search for how this world can become more coherent and cling together is like searching for how you can solve these large equation systems. The bad news is that nearly all, including my own country, seems to, in a way, over-abuse the constructed success that they have engaged in by, in a way, let it all move into a blind alley of rapid growth, rapid booms in housing prices, etc., after which they become so dependent on the financial system that the constructive work that they had so carefully started becomes destroyed by financial institutions. I think the paradox with this is that though the outcome of positive constructions is based on an ability to experiment, the conclusion that you overexploit your potential successes and become even more dependent on the financial institution raises the demand for institutional experimentation to an even higher level. Because how can you then unfreeze that situation by which you have become dependent on these limiting forces that are in the international system at the time? I will try to illustrate how Denmark found a solution by looking at different parts of the system and how it combined into something which mutually enabled each other, and then see why it was destructed and where there are possibilities for hope in the future. And I'm not, because I think it's very difficult to talk so detailed about other countries where you don't know the details of how the change had been happening. So allow me to be focusing on Denmark. The volatility of our business environment has really increased. We had volatile markets already on top of the oil crisis. And there was a huge discussion of how we could deal with it by flexibility and flexible specialization, industrial districts which were operating in a different way. But the volatility we have today is constructed in a very different way. I think as soon as you either become a supplier to a larger corporation or you become a subsidiary, then you are involved in the political game where the performance criteria will always change according to shifting fashions within the financial community, within the management group that happens to manage you at the time. The managers are having very short seniority periods. They come from different countries and they want to go in different directions. What I have seen again and again, especially outside my own country, is that this leads to the self-destruction of the subsidiaries that they manage because there is no coherence between one period and another. So in a way, it's not because these companies are uncompetitive, but what happens in one period does not help it to progress in the next. These are unconnected, and I don't know, people who stay with firms for a long time would see that this incoherence from managing subsidiaries is very aggravating. See, what was strange about our studies in Denmark was that despite these subsidiaries or suppliers for larger companies were living under this regime, they didn't disconnect. They cohered in a very, very interesting way. And you could say they advanced from doing flexible, customized production in the 80s to developing gradually what you could call very advanced products, on top of which they developed sophisticated services which added value to the customers, which were primarily industrial firms or institutions. And then on top of that, they took on to make continuous improvement in the customer organization. Just to illustrate by one company which were producing blood gas equipment for acute sections in hospitals. They were delivering this apparatus in the beginning and servicing it with supplies, etc. But then they found out that in order for acute sections to function better, you should integrate all the other instruments into an integrated ICT system, so you would have coordinated information from all the instruments. So that was the first they made. Then they found out that the practice of operating the instruments, acting on top of what they prescribed was so uneven distributed among acute sections in the world that they found out that they could easily improve nearly all acute sections in hospitals by making continuous improvement systems. And the more they improved one place, the more they learned to improve another place. So they became, in a way, a system for continuous improvement of the survival rate of patients in acute sections. On top of that, they found out that there were instruments that didn't really work and give just-in-time information on the situation in the patient. So a whole series of new needs for doing new innovations were formulated by this. So, and these type of firms we found again and again and again when we were doing field studies. When we asked, how is this possible? How can you live with these changing fashions in management styles and at the same time systematically develop such a coherent strategy? And it turned out that it was the evolution of a very peculiar work system where you in the 80s had delegated competence to run highly sophisticated machinery to operators which could use this for many purposes. And really, a good metal worker would say that when he got a new CNC machine, then there are 16 years of discoveries if you really work with this machine to find out what are the limits of it, right? So you had these experimental actors with their machines trying to push everything to its limit. On top of that, you started to create teams. There were all possible reasons for doing that, which I shall not come into here. But gradually, what came about was a very sophisticated team community in these enterprises, where you could say that everybody belonged to an operative team which had some kind of routine work, which is not routine work in the normal sense, and that was their basis. But then they would be picked because of their expertise to, in combination of ad hoc projects, to innovate when customers were in need of finding a new solution. And then they would get back to their operative teams, and if a new owner came in and wanted something else, they would create such an innovative team and respond to it. But on top of that, they would also, for each operative team, distribute all the operators to have tasks on continuous improvement, depending on what was asked from the top to do performance improvements in, and what was suggested by the workers themselves to do performance criteria. So, and these would meet with operators with the same responsibility in the other teams, and whenever there was a new performance criteria popping down from the financial community, they just distributed this obligation. So in a way, you had a system which was so complex in its team community that it could respond to the volatility by being, in a way, continuous improving its ability to react. And I think the change is quite illustrated. There was a survey made in 1985 that said that 34% of Danish workers applied their own ideas at work often, and 21% now and then, and the rest didn't know what the question meant. In 2000, these two figures have accumulated to 89% of the workforce, and only 11% were not using their own ideas frequently in the workplace. So a revolution along the same period where Denmark went from being heavily engaged in trade but not being really integrated globally by FDI had changed the whole response of the workplace. One of the reasons that this was possible was that the vocational training system had expanded. Denmark has always had a very forceful and powerful craft movement, and they have organized their own vocational training schools, and in opposition to them, what we call specialized workers had created a competitive system for upgrading their skills to contest what were the skilled workers doing and what were the specialized workers. But it was rivaling groups within highly confined circles of the male workers, which were contesting each other on having the new types of work obligations. What happened in the 90s was that the social democratic government institutionalized the active labor market policy, where they offered courses for women, unemployed and low-skilled, that did not only give them skills that were not asked for by the active employed, but those highly asked for by the core workers. So suddenly you had a burst of skill formation all over the place, so that the dynamic of this system in a way became general. And the interesting thing was that this system was managed by what was called regional labor market councils, where the parties in each county would meet and find out how are we going to administer these vocational training schemes in this community. And what you would find if you were a field researcher like me was that they had all types of very different ways, because the transformation needs of local labor markets differed from one area to another. And one of the most fascinating, I thought, was that in Fyn, there was a lot of companies which had seasonal swings for their products, but had an ambition to become high-performance work organization. And how could you do that if you are continually laying off workers? You can't invest in upgrading workers to do this sophisticated. So they found out that 8 firms went, oh no, that's not true. No, that's not fair. They created a scheme where the workers seeking a job in one of these firms would go to the job placement center, which would then have a conversation with them, and then they would embark on a course for half a year, being given the promise that they would at least be employed in one of these firms for 3 months. And you would say, this is how firms exploit the public sector. But what happened was that the flow of workers through these educational programs helped transform the entire labor market within a very short period, so that all these firms could now hire workers which were prepared to work under new conditions. And they would be moving a lot around. In Denmark, almost a third of the working active are shifting jobs every year, though only 5% is unsatisfied with their jobs, and only 20% is normally fired to unemployment. The rest is seeking new job opportunities for their own sake. See, these particular ways of solving the problem happened within welfare states which use the active labor market policy to change from social insurance to supply individualized social services for people so that they could, in a way, get the services that they needed and the skills they needed to enter the labor market. A mother who had been unemployed and was unskilled, how could she come into a labor market if you are not combining all these things? So under the active labor market policy, the job centers would make an individualized contract of how you would assemble welfare state services to help that individual. See, when the quotation was to be solved, it was obvious that the unions played a pivotal role in making it all work. And I'm not talking about unions and as a union. What happened during the same period was that Denmark went away from centralized bargaining, where shop stewards and conveners in the factories would focus on institutionalizing what was agreed centrally and polish that. So they made a shift from distributive bargaining to integrative bargaining. And when I read that by Paul Marginson at the first time, it looked easy. But this, to become an integrative, yeah, you're not a nice person. Okay. What does it take to do integrative bargaining? Well, in Denmark, it means that you has a possibility to create a partnership and become a co-entrepreneur if you can, in a way, stabilize the mentality of the CEO of the subsidiary or the supply firm. And if you can turn that into a permanent partnership where you can act in concert, because the unions in Denmark have access to boards and will have early warnings about what will come before the local managers so they will in a way be able to be much more proactive than the managers. They will also be able to police managers because they can see when these managers are trying to opt for their own careers and opt for the prospects and prosperity of the corporation or the subsidiary. So to learn to strategize this way was an enormous art which they were unprepared to, but engaged in. Then the more performance you demand from an organization, the more you will have middle manager opportunism. So the unions had, in a way, to balance all these opportunistic games among middle managers to advance their own careers so that the system could work. So the coordinating along horizontal lines in understanding with a CEO of the subsidiary became one of the very important things. And then I think, because to me it has been an enigma that the Americans never succeeded in making lean production function with high autonomy to the local levels. And I can understand that, because if you have to shift role all the time, then if you take a worker out to an ad hoc task, then you also destroy the performativity of the team that he leaves, right? So you have to negotiate all the times the changing terms of conditions, because otherwise the system will be totally unfair and go into strikes or unions that sit down and will not be willing to collaborate. And finally, it was obviously that the design of the local adaptation of the active labor market policy and vocational training was basically the design of these conveners and shop stewards, which went together across firms and tried to find out how could we jointly transform our labor markets together with the new forms of work organization. The problem was that they were totally alone. Whenever they asked the union for help and support to perform the new roles, they met silence. There were people who understood them, but they never responded and helped them to find a new role and find a new role for the union. So the practice of all these local union activists changed very rapidly, and the union centrally stayed frozen. I guess I can stop here, but it's a pity for you, but I'll accept that it is this sad condition, right? I think that there is a rounding here, right?